All right, hi there, guys. Johan and I are back once again. Today we're discussing a brand new topic, a new series. We're discussing the Boere War and the belligerents thereof. Yeah. So we got a nice video today for our
Hey,
first part, covering the military tactics um, of the Dutch army and a few of their famous generals and so on. Yeah, anything you want to add, Johan?
am I audible?
You are audible, but
Can you hear
it
me?
sounds like you have a little bit of lag.
Uh, Shoot. Okay. Let me just. Because that's just making. That's probably what's making me laggy. Come on. But yeah. I don't have too much. I like the video, and I think it's pretty interesting. Think about about the about and we never got at the end of the day. I think
Struggling a lot to hear you, man.
it's. So should I wait? Let me do this. That's better.
Semi better.
Are you having lag, or am I just not loud enough?
It was a bit of lag, but I don't know. Whatever you've done seems to have solved it. Okay.
Okay, cool. I just think like we got a very short snippet of history, and it's more fun to get the bigger picture at the end of the day, what led up to certain tactics being used and such. So yeah, it's fun. It's going to be fun.
Yeah. So I quite like military history and stuff like that. So I think this is going to be quite a fun little series of discussion. And yeah, we can, as you say, sort of analyze this from maybe a different point of view to our own inherent South African point of view on the situation. Yeah. So let's start.
The Dutch military reforms in the 16th and 17th century influenced the nature of European warfare strongly and lastingly. Facing the Spanish army, the true military giant of the time, the Dutch were hard pressed to improve their own army with quick but decisive innovation. The backbone of the Spanish military dominance of the time was the so-called tercio, a deep square formation consisting of pikemen and shot infantry, usually supplemented by cavalry and artillery. The basic idea was that the muskets and arquebuses shoot the enemies to pieces, while the pikes provide sufficient protection from enemy cavalry attacks. But how then did the Dutch counter this military Goliath? Recent historiography usually explains it as follows. During the 80 Years' War, it became...
Let's go back for a second.
And I think there's also I'm getting like a double playback.
Are you getting double playback? I should be muting myself, I see. Okay. So if we just take a quick look at this this formation that they've given us. So what we can tell is that the smaller blocks surround one bigger block of pikemen, and in the smaller blocks we've got the arquebuses in the front and we've got pikemen behind them. Whereas on the sides as well, we've got more arquebuses and we've got a block on each side of the block. So this seems like such a devastating point of view, when you think about it from just a military standpoint, you've got guns covering each and every corner of the battlefield formation, and on top of your pikemen, all in formation facing forward with their pike wall, you've got arquebusiers on the side that can shoot at any semi-run by or any breakaway that would come from the main battlefield. And then in the center, we've got some very nicely protected cannons with open position to fire, and our horses on the flank, which we can see looks like what's close to a river or a body of water on top here. So this just seems like such a devastating military tactic. You sit and bombard your enemy, be they trained or untrained, and if they dare advance or try and make an attempt to break into this formation, they are either shot to bits or, if lucky enough to get onto the pikemen, just kept at bay by a very, very long spear. And we'll see this recurring tactic of blocks and guns and how they're used throughout the video and throughout the series. Yeah.
Now, I also want to add a lot of these tactics were surrounded around utilizing firepower as well as possible, and protecting your gunmen as well as possible, because guns were the main, the hardest hitter at the end of the day. Okay, next to the cannons, but yeah.
I think although cannons are devastating, but back when they were first used, I don't believe that they were filled with gunpowder or explosives to that extent. So I think the main use at first would be to bring down support structures and military structures and encampments and things like that, but more also for the factor of fear. I think a cannonball is more than capable of taking out maybe 1 or 2, 3, 4 people in a tight formation. And I can just think of the fear that you would feel seeing one of these cannonballs fly past you and just wipe out the line of your friends. So I think it's a very big psychological factor, the cannon, as well as with the horses. Now, horses can be trained to withstand these things and the sound of battle. But yeah, it can get very panicky, I think.
Cool.
Yeah, let's go.
But how then did the Dutch counter this military Goliath? Recent historiography usually explains it as follows. During the 80 Years' War, it became clear to the Dutch that they had to change their army significantly if they wanted to defend their newly formed federation. But during this period, most armed conflicts actually weren't open field battles, but sieges. As long as they were entrenched in, or themselves sieging a fortress, the expert on this topic, Olaf van Nimwegen, explains, the Dutch were well capable to go toe-to-toe with the Spanish. But it was crucial to have an effective force that could credibly challenge opponents in open field battles to prevent becoming the enemy's puppet. The English...
And just to go a little bit back until the forge is like completely in picture. And when you think about what the formation here is, so you have a circle, so you have 360 vision at the end of the day, and you're a very tightly bound unit. And I think we need to keep that in mind, this specific tactic.
Are you talking about the fortress itself or the block of the Spanish troops?
No, the fortress itself that the Dutch.
I don't know if these are Spanish troops, but this is probably
no, the Dutch.
Yeah,
but exactly, that's what I mean.
So what this is called a star fort. So the star fort is a very useful and a very smart invention, as you say, it gives you protection from all sides. But what you'll also notice is that whichever of these straight walls that you would like to assault with any form of troop or battering ram or something of the sort, you can see that the corners of these little jutted out points can point directly at things that are within these walls' reach. So it makes it a lot more difficult to attack this wall than it would be to just attack a straight wall, because you're being shot at from the side and possibly from behind. And then more than that, there's also this giant moat. Or moat or trench, more than likely a trench. If you are doing warfare and you're not digging a trench, then you're not doing warfare and you're losing whatever you're trying to defend. It's always hilarious to me when in movies they depict this gigantic battle. I'm going to even quote Game of Thrones, because Game of Thrones is the most egregious example to me. This final big battle, they've got all of the forces of mankind facing the forces of the undead. And what do? They put their catapults on the outside of the walls. Their catapults, their long-range artillery that should be protected, gets put on the outside of the walls. They just put all their horsemen on the outside of the walls, as well as all of the rest of their troops, and just charge the hordes of the undead, rather than logically holding the walls of the fortress that you're trying to protect. The point is just, you got to dig your trench.
I just think that the general idea behind the fort is something that repeated itself in South African history as well. And he's saying here that the Dutch could hold their own if they were allowed this tactic.
Correct.
So, yeah.
The warfare in this period of time turned away from combats in the open field, battles in the open field, and turned more to long, extended, sloggy kind of sieges, which obviously the Dutch will have had experience in, but it evolved further than that when we're coming to the era of the Boere War. So the Dutch people in South Africa and the collection of Boere from different countries, of course, used a very similar tactic to this specific fort formation that we're looking at. Specifically when we talk about the Battle of BLOEDRIVIER, the Battle of BLOEDRIVIER. They formed a big circle with their ox wagons. With their ox wagons. They posted their guns on the corners. They had, I think we'll get deeper into it, but they had a few cannons that they loaded with just whatever was around, so nice forks, these types of things, and they held the surrounding wagon fort essentially. And it's a devastatingly effective tactic. It's devastatingly effective. The stories and the legend as it goes of BLOEDRIVIER is that the Boere were outnumbered by a lot. I suppose we'll get into further videos that explain the battle itself. But the point was, because of this defensive structure, because of this defensive acumen that they had from previously fighting in Europe and fighting against overwhelming forces like the Mongols and the Huns, the Europeans learned very well how to hold their fortresses.
And we'll see. I'll just leave it for later. So let's go.
Let's keep going.
The expert on this topic, Olaf van Nimwegen, explains the Dutch were well capable to go toe-to-toe with the Spanish, but it was crucial to have an effective force that could
Forgot to mute myself.
incredibly challenge opponents in open field battles to prevent becoming the enemy's puppet. The English officer John Bingham, who had served in the Dutch army, summarized this as follows, quote, "He who is master of the field may spoil the enemy's country at his pleasure. He may march where he thinketh best," end quote. Thus,
that's such a good point that I'd like to discuss. As I mentioned before, the Mongols, the Mongol horde, they exploited this to a significant extent. They took whatever land and whatever resources they could find on their European and Asian inquests, and they held people with enormous amounts of numbers and great siege technology that they could take around with them. They held them in their fortresses, and when their fortresses broke, they had nowhere else to run to. They had no supplies to take into their fortresses. So often the siege equipment wasn't even necessary because they would run out of supplies. So there is a clear sort of Uno reverse card to this style of defense. If your supply lines get cut out, you can't defend. You have to give up. And when you give up, you die. Or you have to, I suppose, sally out and go meet the force. Yeah, and obviously not only the Mongols and the Huns that used this has been used by tons and tons of people. Hannibal used it against the Romans when he marched across the Alps. He marched into the Roman country as the Romans tried to protect themselves, and he spoiled their valleys and harvested all of their minerals to try and attack them. Lucky them, he was stopped.
Yeah, let's go.
The Dutch were primarily concerned with ameliorating their capabilities in open field battles. With the military transformation the Dutch were about to undertake, they set in motion a decisive evolution of warfare, eventually influencing the famous Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus. And well beyond his doings, the change in warfare that in due course led to the linear conduct of battle in the 18th century. Three of the strongest proponents of change in military tactics and strategy were the Counts of Nassau, Maurits, Prince of Orange, and his cousins Willem Lodewijk and Johan VII. In February of 1599, they issued a revised order for the regulation for the arming of the infantry. The focus was on replacing melee weapons with ever more muskets and pikes. Historian Olaf van Nimwegen states that, quote, the sword and buckler and broadswords disappeared from the Dutch army formation around 1595, and halberdiers were replaced by pikemen in 1599, end quote. Previously, these types of weapons were used to break the deadlock which ensued when two pike formations got entangled with one another. The shields were used to push the pikes to the side, and the two-handers served to break the pikes themselves and to spread panic among the enemies. This was a messy fight. To improve chances in such grapples, Maurits at some point even thought about using bigger square shields like the ancient Romans did. But he scrapped the idea quickly, knowing that the way forward was to deploy more guns, not more melee. However, Maurits and his fellow reformers were indeed heavily inspired by classical Roman, Hellenistic and Byzantine literature, hoping it would provide them with new ideas to overcome the Spanish pike squares. Many contemporary writers, such as the Dutch scholar Justus Lipsius, drew parallels between the massive Spanish infantry formation of the early modern era and the Macedonian phalanx of the classical past. In classical antiquity, the pike squares of the Macedonians eventually fell to the more maneuverable Roman maniples. Lipsius, who read the classical literature extensively, stressed the opportunities that a more
let's just hold on here for a second. Oh, you're muted. Strange. Yeah. So
I muted myself.
Yeah. I keep forgetting to mute myself. There. So something interesting he mentioned, the Roman maniple. So the maniple system is quite ingenious. So it's also sometimes referred to as the the name escapes me. Not the point. They used to form their troops in blocks. So they had 3 rows of troops, with the youngest at the front, the more equipped in the middle, and the most equipped in the back. And what made this really particularly good was that their blocks were divided into centuries, and each which it would be 50 men, and each 50 men would be divided, groups of 50 men, into one battalion, and you would have 50 battalions in a legion or something to that extent. But the point is, this is a very early example of a very Napoleonic style of warfare. where you're giving a certain extent of command to someone who is lower than the commander, but still able to command the troops underneath him. So it starts to get a very military sort of
hierarchy structure.
Yeah, and that's the difference between the Roman century and legions and maniples and the Macedonian phalanx. The Macedonian phalanx was controlled by a single person or a few person, or like maybe one commander commanding 1,000 or so troops, and that's just chaotic.
Yeah.
Very effective. Yeah. But anyway, let's keep.
Maneuverable formation might offer in the 16th century as well. Maurits and Lipsius were not the only ones looking back to classical times for advice. There had been an increased interest in the potential offered by the Roman art of war throughout the 16th century. Particularly the text of Vegetius, De Re Militari, and Frontius' Strategmata, Caesar, Livy, and Polybius too were read often. The famous Niccolo Machiavelli in particular had linked ancient Roman and Greek tactics with his own idea on contemporary warfare in his Libra della Arte della Guerra. However, although this interest in the classics might have inspired the Dutch, they did not truly adopt the Roman way of warfare, as historian Werner Hallweg pointed out rightly. After all, the tactics of the 16th century, such as the deployment of masses of musketeers and cannons, required a drastically different approach to battle. Nevertheless, the Dutch did copy some parts of the Romans, such as the deployment of 3 lines of infantry like in the manipular system. This change in warfare and its interest in classical antiquity alike led to much scholarly attention in modern days. This particular scholarly debate is usually referred to as military revolution, a term coined by Michael Roberts in 1955. At its core, the debate is concerned with the exploration of changes in siege equipment, firearms, tactics, organization, drill, and army composition. But Roberts also stressed the impact of this change in military affairs for social, economic, and political change, as a catalyst for bridging the Middle Ages with the modern era. But that is not the subject of this video. However, for any student of warfare, it is important to note that much of the literature on this topic bears the stamp of this debate, and that the concept has seen extensive adaptations, alterations, and criticism, for example by influential historians such as Geoffrey Parker, Jeremy Black, and Andrew Ayton. According to historian Marcus Neumann, quote, "It now makes sense to replace the concept of a military revolution with that of evolution. This, by the way, is the reason why our series is called Evolution of Warfare." However, looking at the Roman way of fighting, the Dutch deployed their troops in smaller, more maneuverable units and increased the number of gunmen. The main change of the time was the reliance on firearms to win battles. According to Van Nimwegen, quote, "After 1609, the Dutch army consisted exclusively of pikes and musketeers," end quote. The Dutch reformers hoped to counter the Spanish superiority in 2 ways, quote, "by drilling and exercising the troops, and, during battle, by dissipating the thrust of an enemy assault across various relatively small units," end quote. The impact of the enemy's assault was spread following the examples of the Romans. This is to say that the battalions were positioned behind one another in a checkered order. The troops in the front line could easily be relieved or reinforced by the battalions disposed further to the rear. Maurits and Willem no longer divided their army in the usual 3 parts of vanguard, battle, and rearguard, as it was common for the Swiss or Landsknechts mercenaries. They subdivided their battle arrays into smaller units of 800 to 900 men, later on 500 to 600 men. With this formation, the overall risk could be effectively spread. If one battalion fled, not dysfunctional. Drilling and exercising the army ensured that the tactics would be implemented as well as possible. An instinctive working knowledge of this was vital to success in battle, because the hearing distance in combat when wearing helmets was limited, and the loud muskets, horses, and cannons further complicated communication during battle. In addition, the sheer inaccuracy, the backbone of the Spanish military dominance of.
So, I think it's also valuable to note here how the Dutch were pretty comfortable fighting in very small groups. So the Dutch were comfortable in fighting in small groups, and they knew how to stick to a certain formation at the end of the day.
That's pretty much what we were going back to with smaller groups. It is easier to organize action. So trying to organize 1,000, 10,000 people at a time with a flag or a whistle or whatever you want to use, versus controlling maybe 500, 600 people at a time, is obviously there's obviously its advantage. It's the same as why you send your kids to private school, because you have one teacher for like 10 kids instead of one teacher for 40. So let's get back to the video.
An instinctive working knowledge of this was vital to success in battle, because the hearing distance in combat when wearing helmets was limited, and the loud muskets, horses, and
cool
cannons further complicated communication during battle. In addition, the sheer inaccuracy of gunfire and the required time to reload meant that a successful deployment of firearms was possible only when several shots were discharged at once, and each subsequent volley followed after a short interval. Otherwise, the enemy had the chance to regroup and charge the musketeers. Under the stressful and chaotic battle conditions, it was possible to discharge 1, maybe 2 shots per minute. Prior to 1594, the records reveal nothing about the way in which the Dutch were expected to discharge their weapons as a hail of fire. The first evidence surfaces in 1594 at the hands of Willem Lodewijk, who wrote in a letter to Maurits, quote, namely, that as soon as the first rank has fired simultaneously, it steps back per evolutionem et versum. This means an about turn and return to the rear of the block. But the second rank steps forward or stands still and shoots simultaneously, then marches back. The third and the following do the same. Thus, before the last rank has fired, the first has reloaded. Willem included a diagram of a formation which spans 9 men across and 5 ranks deep. This maneuver was called countermarch, because the soldiers retreated to the opposite, the counter direction. Its problem was that a musketeer needed, according to Van Nimwegen, quote, at least 3 feet of space to maneuver on either side, while simultaneously making sure that his smoldering match did not ignite another soldier's gunpowder, end quote. Likewise, this formation required a street, measuring 6 feet across to be kept free between each file, so that soldiers who had fired could return to the back. Thus, the formation was fairly wide and loose, and therefore not well protected from enemy cavalry. In the summer of 1595, Willem came up with a solution to this problem. The major change was that the gunmen no longer performed individual about turns. Instead, they made a turn as a rank and marched in file to the rear of the unit to get ready again. Later on, the ranks retreated both along the right and the left of the formation. This made possible that the ranks could clear the front more quickly. By decreasing the number of musketeers in each block from 9 to 5 or 6 men, it was possible to increase the rate of fire even more. Enemies could consequently be kept at a distance more easily. But even this tactic had a disadvantage, which became clear during the Battle of Newport. The Dutch deployed their battalions with 250 pikemen and 240 musketeers, divided into 5 blocks of pikemen, each 5 men across and 9 deep, and 6 blocks of musket, each 4 men across and 10 men deep. Such a unit had a front of 57 meters, 183 feet. It became evident that the pikemen were unable to provide adequate cover for the gunmen.
Just a thought that occurred to me. So, just imagine what the amount of time it took for them to get into formation. Like they would arrive at the battlefield and everyone would like march and get into formation and get ready. All the other side was just marching and getting ready, all in formation.
Yeah. It must be a really interesting sight to.
I think it should be weird.
To be marching up and you're just maybe a kilometer across the way, being the opposing army also marching up doing their thing. But often marching to the field of battle is where a lot of casualties happen. We can again look at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, very famous Roman Battle of Teutoburg Forest. They lost 2 legions in Teutoburg Forest because they were marching in a column through a dense forest, and the Germanic people just used guerrilla warfare, attacked them from all sides, attacked their supply lines, raided them continuously, and at the end of the day, there were 2 dead legions stretching like a kilometer-long path in Teutoburg Forest. So often the march up to battle is one of the most dangerous parts. So reconnaissance is very necessary.
Yeah, imagine like the enemy decided to wake up like an hour early, and they're already in formation while you're marching, and they just start
You just get
firing.
red lane on you. Because, I don't know, of the
Maybe.
Dutch morning ethic.
Yeah, maybe they were just, they had a dog that kept or woke them early one day, and they just woke up an hour early, basically just out of pure coincidence, and you just get shit whipped.
Well, that's really funny. But I suppose they've got people on watch and shit.
Yeah,
In case of night attacks, because I'm sure night attacks are also a thing while you're in camp and stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, let's get back to it.
Adequate cover for the gunmen when they were subject to a cavalry charge, 4 men across and 10 men deep. Such a unit had a front of 57 meters, 183 feet. It became evident that the pikemen were unable to provide adequate cover for the gunmen when they were subject to a cavalry charge. Because if they were charged, the gunmen could not retreat behind a group of pikes without confusion. The solution was only found in the Jülich campaign in 1610. There, the musketeers were deployed behind the pikes, moved forward in unison to fire, and then retreated simultaneously. Henceforth, the front rank often kneeled down while the rear rank remained standing. This made possible a volley of 144 musketeers at once. Historian Geoffrey Parker called this, quote, a production line of death. With that change, the inaccuracy problem of the musket was temporarily solved as well. This tactic was adopted by others quickly, for example by Gustavus Adolphus, who used it at the famous Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631. He developed it even further. He drilled his troops so that they improved their reload speed considerably, enabling them to continuously fire with only 6 ranks deep, instead of the 10 ranks the Dutch used. Additionally, he started to deploy masses of field artillery. Maurits did not really like the heavy cannons because of their limited movability. He deployed a mere 8 guns at Newport. Gustavus and his Protestant allies, in contrast, boasted 51 heavy guns at Breitenfeld in 1631. In the cavalry department, Gustavus made significant changes as well. While Maurits replaced his lancers with cuirassiers in 1594, Gustavus often relied on his melee cavalry to charge his enemies. Maurits' decision actually made sense. Despite the popular intuition about flat ground in the Netherlands, heavy cavalry was not always well suited for the difficult terrain, such as marshes or intentionally flooded regions. Moreover, charging headfirst into pikes did not end well for cavalry either. In addition, lancers required a lot of training, and had to be very good horsemen too. They charged at full speed, and hence, the risk of such a charge was very high. It was a go big or go home move. It was only the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus who again popularized charging enemy infantry and cavalry armes blanches, that is, steel in hand. But that will be a topic for another video.
All right.
That's cool.
There we go. So, it's a very interesting development of army tactics. It's really interesting to see how a nation who previously relied on sword and buckler and flambeauge troops and spear ranks moved to a more modernistic type of warfare. And when we look at warfare in the past with melee weapons to semi-futuristic with guns and melee weapons added in, and then warfare today, there's obviously a very clear trend of guns getting bigger and deployment troops, so sort of people who you send out to do things become smaller as well. Battalions now have become things of like 30 men when you're talking about urban warfare, obviously.
Sometimes
something like Normandy, we're talking about thousands of men.
Yeah. Sometimes when it's really urban, they go out in even groups of 4 or 5.
Yeah, I mean, reconnaissance, special operations, maneuvers, things like that.
No. I think what's also interesting to notice is that in the beginning, the Dutch were they already had some sort of like some kind of a dynamic type of tactic, and then they just it evolved at the end of the day into something more complex. And I think that's also something that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah. I've got another video lined up for us if you're keen to go for it on Zulu war tactics. Since, yeah, we want to cover both sides. This one is it's a bit of a longer one, but it's also a pretty cool one. Yeah. I think this one covers the Battle of Isandlwana in 1879. So yeah, let's take a look.
If you were to travel to around the year 1780 to the southeast of Africa and witness a battle, it would look something like this. There would be two groups of men, not very large groups of men. They'd be jeering at each other, probably having some sort of dance-off before throwing spears at one another. Not many people would die, and essentially it would be more like a big kind of sports day event rather than what we would recognize as a battle. Now let's go to the year 1815. Now it looks incredibly different. One of the groups of men charges at the others, surrounds them, and then stabs them all to death with short spears. What ensues is a massacre, and none of the enemy tribe remains. But of course, we have to wonder, what changed in Southeast Africa with the nature of warfare in this time? John Lampier in African Military History describes what came before so traditional African warfare, that it demonstrated 4 key factors that appeared in varying degrees of consistency across the region: control of people and resources instead of territory, utilization of numerically small forces, conducting raids instead of engaging in protracted conflicts, and rudimentary logistics. So really what we need to remember about African warfare before the period of about 1800 is that it was small scale because the tribes and the numbers involved were small scale. And actually there was always the choice of relocation and moving to a new area rather than fighting it out to the death. So casualties were very small because the tribal groups themselves were small. These battles, as I said, were more often show events with dance-off kind of things and competitive throwing of spears, and then basically whichever tribe danced better or threw the spears better would be the victor, rather than someone who tactically took the field or killed the most enemies, because casualties were very small. And this meant that defeated clans weren't completely eradicated, but rather simply moved off to settle in a new piece of land. Now, this all changed around 1800, and this is partially thanks to the change in equipment that was being used. Now, beforehand, the traditional equipment of the African warrior was the throwing spear, so a long spindly spear that was good for throwing, as well as a kind of club, which actually in Zulu is called the iwisi. But actually, for some reason, the Afrikaans word knopkili is sometimes used in English as well. And for some reason, this was standard vocabulary for me in my household, which I blame my dad.
A knopkili.
Baby, wil je my knopkili?
My knopkili. Oh no, I think you're muted. Oh, sad.
Nah, I just muted myself. Don't worry.
Lol. Yeah. So I don't know. This video seems kind of amateuristic. I just want to kind of look at the battle itself. So let's
But
look at this one
I
specifically.
think it's good to note as well that they also had some form of range versus close range, long range versus and close range weapons. So they had similar type of tactics for utilizing their long range to the best of their abilities, and also using their short range only when it's really needed, when the battle's really up close.
Or when it's beneficial, when you manage to get around to the
Yeah,
back of whoever is throwing whatever.
yeah, yes,
Engaging
yes.
them with shorter weapons and in
Yeah,
closer combat is then very effective.
yeah.
So let's look at the Battle of Isandlwana.
The year is 1878. British colonialism in South Africa is in full swing. Seeking to expand their rule, the British turned their sights towards the Kingdom of Zululand. The build-up to war began slowly. The British had controlled the southernmost tip of Africa, Cape Town, since the 1820s. Over time, Cape Town expanded, first coming into conflict with the Xhosa, Khoikhoi, and San people. The British Commissioner of South Africa, Sir Brodel Freire, desired to create an African federation, absorbing many African tribes and peoples into a single nation under British rule, a federation that the large and militant Zulu would never accept. In addition to the dream of federation, the neighboring British allies, the Boer, had laid claim to a large chunk of the land the Zulu controlled. Lastly, the recent discovery of diamond wealth in Natal necessitated more laborers. The Zulu were numerous, and if they could be convinced to work the mines, would bring significant wealth to the British. As such, the British marched to war with 3 objectives. 1. Destroy the Kingdom of Zululand, absorbing their lands and sending a strong message of the consequences of resisting British Federation. 2. Support Boer claims on Zulu land, ensuring the British allies held the land. 3. Pacify the Zulu people to serve as laborers in British ventures. As plans for the invasion were being laid, Sir Freire sent an ultimatum to Zulu King Getishweyu Kamupande. His demands were as follows. 1. Pay reparations for previous Zulu infractions against Natal. And 2. End the Zulu military system. Addressing that first point, it was true that Zulu warriors had on occasion crossed into Natal, once to retrieve 2 wives who had run away, and once again to abduct 2 British citizens who were later returned unharmed. This demand, while inflammatory, was not without basis. The second demand, ending the Zulu military system, was what was unconscionable to the Zulu. Their military system was the entire foundation of their government and society. Each Zulu was a boy until they were inducted into the militia system and pledged their loyalty to the king. This was the basis of their entire government and society. This wasn't the British asking them to just disband their military, which in and of itself was unreasonable. This was the British asking them to disband their military, government, and king. The Zulu refused the ultimatum, and in January...
Yeah, I think this is a really good point to notice, is that the Zulu nation was a very militant nation, and it was part of their pride. I think asking such a colony or such a tribe to dismantle probably their primary identity would not go off well.
Well, yeah, I suppose that happens from any aggressor to any defender. If we look at Zululand itself, the Zulu people moved and they merged throughout history. As we heard from our previous video, they started with smaller villages and smaller groups of people, and they started to come together as a group after obviously going on and through people, and those who didn't want to join obviously were put to the sword, as any nation does. You know, you conquer something, and once conquering it, you take people from that conquered nation to increase the overall strength of your nation. And this has happened throughout history in Europe and in Asia. That has been very recorded. And the same thing happened in Africa with the Zulu people. The Zulu people obviously marched through southern Africa down towards the Natal area, the KwaZulu-Natal area. And this is where they chose to settle their people. And they formed Zululand. Zululand previously also belonged to somebody else. And it was taken over by the Zulu people. And then it belonged to them. So let's see how it plays off. But as you mentioned, they were quite the militaristic culture. And to ask a militaristic culture and a culture that had previously been dominant in their own continent to change their ways and to reform to you is never going to go well. It's just not.
No.
So let's take a look.
January of 1879, a British force of 15,000 men under the command of Lord Chelmsford advanced into Zululand. The British did not expect the enemy to meet them in the field, and instead to use guerrilla tactics. As such, the British split their force into 3 columns, which the British command was confident could defeat any Zulu force stupid enough to openly attack them. After all, these were backwards Africans with shields and pointy sticks. The Zulu, on the other hand, had every intention to face the British in open battle, and Ntishweyo called his 40,000 Zulu militia the Order. The British had invaded at the start of the planting season in order to limit the amount of time the Zulu militia could spend in the field and still harvest their crops. The Zulu were on the clock, and the king intended to score a decisive victory, then quickly sue for peace. The center column, under the command of Chelmsford, approaches Isilawanda after 2 weeks. The rainy season has slowed the British advance to a crawl, while the Zulu traveled lightly and with speed. Frustrated with the slow pace and sure of the superiority of his men, Lord Chelmsford was advancing recklessly, with minimal scouting and camping without building defensive structures. The Zulu, on the other hand, advanced in 2 columns to prevent the entire force being ambushed, and extensively used scouts, backed up by 1 to 200 strong warrior groups. These groups were tasked with keeping the Zulu movement secret, and would engage and kill any interlopers the Zulu scouts discovered before their location could be reported to the enemy command. The British arrived and camped at the base of Isilawanda, less than 10 miles inside of Zululand. They were unaware a massive Zulu force was camped just 7 miles away. Arriving at Isilawanda were almost 3,500 British. Of those, only half, 1,800 men, would participate in the battle. 800 regulars, and roughly 1,000 colonial and native militia, a mix of ill-equipped infantry and mounted cavalry. They also had an artillery detachment consisting of 2 7-pound guns and a rocket battery. The Zulu had almost 20,000 infantry concealed in the hills. As the British moved, they were watched by Zulu scouts.
A rocket battery. That seems difficult to carry through the marshy KwaZulu-Natal area, all the way to Cape Town. That seems like, wow, really. It's difficult.
I think we see this a lot of times in history where people just get overeager and they go to take over someone's ground, and then they just bump their head so hard because they don't know the terrain. They don't know the secrets or the different valleys and everything around them. So, and it's quite the Americans did it as well at Vietnam. So it's not such an old thing. It happens very often, and it happened recently as well. So,
yeah, one of the greatest military nations in the world lost the war to a bunch of rice farmers. So overconfidence is a killer.
Exactly.
Let's keep watching.
Scouts in the surrounding hills. These scouts did not go unnoticed, and units of Natal Auxiliary were sent out to scout the surrounding areas. There, they met the Zulu warrior groups, and minor skirmishes broke out. Believing the Natals had met the vanguard of a Zulu force, Chelmsford took a full half of his men and gave chase. Command of the camp was assumed by Colonel Anthony Durnford, who arrived with reinforcements from Warwick's Drift. The Zulu warrior groups retreated away from their camp, drawing Chelmsford and half of the British force away from Isilawanda. Soon after, Natal scouts reported the presence of Zulu forces in the hills surrounding Isilawanda. However, the British believed this to be a force of just 4,000 men, and the Zulu warriors successfully screened the main force hidden behind the hills. The British thought this force was maneuvering to flank Chelmsford, and Durnford took a force of cavalry and the artillery battery to root them out, leaving Lieutenant Colonel Pauline in command of the camp. Meanwhile, the Zulu were waiting. They sent a force to outflank Isilawanda and intended to attack the following day. The British cavalry, however, chased the Zulu scouts back into their camp, thus discovering that there were not 4,000 Zulu hidden in the mountain as they had thought, but really 20,000. With their force discovered, the order to charge was given, and the Zulu surged towards the British. The Zulu charge quickly became uncontrollable as they rushed down the hills towards the British camp. They weren't expecting any action until tomorrow and weren't prepared to attack. However, the Zulu were disciplined and independently formed into the standard Zulu attack formation, with a large body of men directly attacking, while the horns spread to encircle the enemy. The surprised British cavalry took up a skirmishing formation and kept the Zulu at bay with rifle fire. However, their retreat quickly outpaced their rocket battery, which was overrun. Back at camp, Pauline took defensive measures. He ordered the hill reinforced, the cannons brought up to a firing position, and a line of battle formed. As the Zulu body of 10,000 men crested the ridge across the valley, the British suddenly realized, oh shit, we've made a huge mistake. On the ridge, the Zulu left horn moved to seize the high ground and out.
Man, trying to pause there. Okay, so they didn't really go very much into detail on the classic Zulu formation. So the usual and the classic Zulu formation was the bullhead method, where they would have their main force in the center with the horns of the bull flanking around to encircle the enemy and to crush them from all sides. So they would have their youngest on the horns of the bull, and the youngest warriors would be able to run fast and maneuver fast and get around the enemy fast. And they were likely armored and equipped, but they, with their ability to flank, they made devastating. They inflicted devastating casualties on armies, whereas the center would be better equipped and older and stronger and more proven men who would be tasked to hold the front line, as it were.
I think this was maybe a special case because of the eagerness of the colonialists. They had to make initial contact first, and then they had to send their main group. Sorry, they had to send in the main group a bit later. But if you look at it, it's still kind of like the main body here in the middle is the largest group, and then you have two flanks on the side. So the basic structure is still there.
Yeah. Okay, so let's continue watching. Let's see what happens.
Flank their enemy. At this point, much of the Natal auxiliary fled, and I can't say I blame them. Many didn't have rifles, and fighting hand-to-hand against Zulu warriors who outnumbered you 20 to 1 is not a winning prospect. The British men holding the hill beat a fighting retreat and met reinforcements at the base. In the center, the Zulu were forced to take shelter from British fire, either in dried river beds or against the ground. Several Zulu regiments were pinned behind small hills due to the cannon fire. Cannons in this age were not the crude ball throwers of the American Revolutionary War. They were rifled, long-range weapons with explosive shells. On the right, the cavalry regrouped on the banks of a dried riverbed and used a natural barrier to cut down the Zulu. The British, it seemed, were winning, and their morale was high, until everything went south. The cavalry were now running low on ammunition and can't hold without resupply. They mount up and rush back to camp. Seeing the British right retreating, the chiefs commanding the Zulu chest urged their men onwards. There are simply too many Zulu for the British to repel, and their right is undefended. The British fall back and tighten their ranks, giving ground to buy distance from Zulu spears and moving closer to their ammunition stores. The Zulu saw their opportunity in the brief confusion as the British maneuvered. Zulu warriors from the left horn rushed the British line and broke through. This created a break in the firing line the Zulu exploited. Zulu rushed in on the left and the right, which was exhausted and still low on ammunition, while the Zulu chest kept the pressure on the British center, preventing them from redeploying to fill the break in their flanks. The British line collapsed, Zulu flooding in from all directions. The British fought desperately, forming squares and fighting to the last, but they were overwhelmed. In the end, there were just too many Zulu. The battle turned into a rout and then a slaughter. The survivors flee with the Zulu in pursuit, while the Zulu do not pursue the survivors into Natal, as King Katashawe had ordered. The 4,000-man strong reserve disobeys their king, crossing into Natal and attacking the mission at Rorke's Drift. But that battle is a story for a different day. The British force was almost entirely destroyed, with only 60 of the 800 British escaping and nearly 500 of their Natal auxiliary killed. The Zulu suffered roughly the same. Britain was shocked by this loss. Almost 1,000 of their highly trained sons, soldiers of the world's only superpower, had been killed by angry villagers with sharp sticks. Paradoxically, Isolawanda sealed the fate of the Zulu nation. Freer had not received permission from the British government to instigate this war. It was a surprise to the British government and people, and they were not happy. However, the defeat to British pride had to be answered. Spear-wielding Africans simply could not defeat the world's only superpower. The war would drag on for another 5 months, but in the end, the Zulu were defeated, their kingdom divided, and King Katashawe exiled. Chelmsford would never again command an army in the field. Back in Britain, the British leadership did everything they could to explain away this defeat. British media emphasized the importance of the Battle of Rorke's Drift, which was insignificant compared to Isolawanda, but a British victory. The British leadership also circulated some misinformation, some of which I've seen repeated as true even today. The most common was that the British couldn't access their ammunition. The British at the time stored ammunition in large crates secured by copper bands. The lie goes that the British couldn't undo the bands to access their ammunition quickly enough due to a shortage of screwdrivers or incompetent quartermasters or some other nonsense. In actuality, the ammunition could be accessed by a sliding door secured by a single screw, and this could be easily smashed open if needed. This line is disproven by the lids of ammunition cases found scattered throughout the British lines, and that no first-hand accounts, either British or Zulu, state that there was a break in the firing. It was simply easier to explain away the defeat to screwdrivers, which is an easy fix, just get more screwdrivers, than it is to admit that the British leadership was systemically incompetent.
What a rant at the end. Cross almighty. But I think if you notice, they still used the flanking, because at the end of the day, they overwhelmed them on the sides and pushed through on the sides. And so the basic tactic still was the same at the end of the day. You're muted. You're muted.
Swag. When it's trained and drilled into you as a group, it becomes almost like second nature just to go with your usual army tactic. So yeah, that's just what they would do. So we've analyzed the Dutch style of fighting. This is now a lot earlier than the Zulu style of fighting that we've looked at, but as we've previously discussed, the Zulu style of fighting is a bit more of more ancient yet modern. Their ranks and their armies became bigger around the 17th and the 18th centuries, when they were able to field more like thousands of men and less like hundreds of men.
And warfare wasn't as common as it was in Europe. And
well, maybe as common, but not as big scale, not as large.
Yeah. That's actually, that's what I meant, is that the scale of warfare wasn't the same. So and I think it's interesting because the British came with modern warfare at the time, and they had guns and they had cannons, and they still lost.
They were outplayed. No better way to put it. They were outplayed.
Well, they were also vastly outnumbered, but still.
Pretty outplayed.
Yes.
I'm reasonably sure that if they did their army composition correctly and didn't fall for the bait, they would have probably held a lot better. Alien. No, stop it. So yeah, this was a fun analysis of the general idea of the two armies. I think next time we can try and get more into what happened at BLOEDRIVIER and what led up to it.
I think maybe we should have a look at the migration of the Boere up north into Natal, and also look at basically, well, the Zulus were already settled there, but maybe if we can try to track back to when the Zulus were also maybe migrating around into the Natal area.
Yeah.
And
what led up to the conflict?
Yeah, so we can, because it's kind of like a clash of coming together.
Yeah, a clash of two underdogs, as it were.
Actually, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay. So thanks, guys, for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe. I'll link Johan's channel as well in the description. This was fun. Peace out.
Bye.
Ciao.